Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer Fantasy lore. Today we are going to be returning to everyone's favourite fluffy fanatics, more specifically, one of the Skaven great clans, and we'll start out with my favourite, Clan Skryre. This particularly lovely wobbly collection of furry psychopaths have grown particularly attached to machines. And of course, being Skaven, they are not wasting their time building bigger and better household appliances. Clan Skryre is not wasting their precious time building a bigger and better fridge to store more warp tokens. Oh no, Clan Skryre is busily occupied with building a bigger and better bomb. Or, well, bigger, anyways. Better does not always make it onto the agenda here, because, frankly, if you're trying to make something safe, you're a faggot and should be ashamed of yourself. Real ratmen only occupy their brilliant minds with making things that go boom, very, very loudly, and may the horned rat damn the consequences. Besides, the Skaven Empire has more than enough slaves for testing purposes. Really, if there's one resource that Skavendom will never grow short of, it is silly little creatures that can be used for target practice. In fact, some of the more controversial Clan Skryre engineers even use slaves to test their weapons. Now, of course, this is a fairly ludicrous idea. I mean, why would you deny yourself the thrill of testing a new invention? I mean, yes, granted, there is the overhanging danger of death, mutilation, or just simply being scorched into an unrecognizable piece of fucking furry coal, but hey, that comes with a job. And don't worry, even though a few less reputable members of the Engineers Guild, Engineers Guild, that's a really fucking grand name for a collection of ratmen that occasionally agree to not murder each other, the Clan Skryre Collective is perhaps a slightly better word for it. And yes, although a few individuals have decided to take the pussy way out and not personally test their own devices, rest assured that the vast majority of the glorious engineers of Clan Skryre still have some professional pride in their explosion-making capabilities, and will more than happily test out their own stuff. These brave souls, driven by a spirit of innovation and pioneering ingenuity, just simply the fact that Skaven minds are very rarely capable of any kind of doubt as far as their own capabilities are concerned. Remember, every Skaven is a brilliant mastermind, woefully underappreciated by his stupid, idiotic peers. Despite the criminal lack of recognition, however, various Clan Skryre engineers have created some downright wonderful weapons over the years, including such wonderful things as the Warp Fire Thrower, which is essentially a flamethrower, except it fires a substance fueled by Warpstone, making it about 10 times worse. Or the Rattling Gun, which is a minigun if miniguns were prone to explode and shower anyone nearby with, Warpstone bullets, or the Poisoned Wind Mortar, which is surprisingly one of the more reliable weapons in the Skaven arsenal. Assuming, of course, that the Poisoned Wind globes, being relatively fragile glass containers filled with poisonous gas, don't break. Now, granted, even if they break, the crew itself doesn't really give that much of a shit, which may or may not contribute to the somewhat, mishap-prone nature of the weapon, because they're wearing gas masks. Ingenious gas masks as well that consist of various levels of piping and filtering connected to a large backpack that continuously scrubs the air, as close to clean as ratishly possible. And alongside these more aggressive inventions, Clan Skryre has also created quite a few more civilian-friendly things, I suppose. For example, they have created a gigantic underground drilling system that drills out entire habitable tunnels in half of the time it takes Clan Moulder burrowing beasts to do the same work. Of course, there's the slight problem that it has a nasty tendency of blowing up and taking the entire fucking tunnel complex with it, and that one time it almost destroyed Skavenblight, but besides that, it's a fairly useful thing. There's also the marvellous Far Squeaker, which is essentially a telephone, except Skaven, therefore squeaky, and it doesn't even blow up that often. Granted, the sound quality is absolutely fucking awful, but that might have been put in there by design, because it's a hell of a lot easier to misunderstand your boss's orders in a way that is more beneficial to your own little tale when you can't quite hear him. Oh, what's that, boss? You're coming down tunnel 33, and you want me to blow it up, you say? I'm right on that, boss. Like that kind of thing. Of course, any entrepreneuring Skaven that decides to take advantage of the shitty sound quality to further his own goals had better make damn fucking sure that he hits the first time, but still, that's pretty much life as usual in the Under Empire. And you might have noticed a bit of a theme in many of these machines. They all, pretty much, use Warpstone either for ammunition or as a fuel source. The massive burrowing drills, for example, use Warpstone as a fuel source. The Warpfire Thrower and the Rattling guns use them as ammunition. The deadly Jeziles use them as both. A Jezile is essentially a remarkably large musket, larger than pretty much any other musket, and has a considerable range because its, shall we say, fuel source, or, well, you know, the powder, is gunpowder mixed with warpstone, which creates a rather unstable concoction that burns very, very quickly, making it excellent for launching heavy projectiles at ridiculous speeds and ridiculous ranges. The ammunition, additionally, is often, depending on how valuable the target is, either a massive leaden ball with a warpstone coating or core, depending on how heavily armored the target is, or even just a solid slab of warpstone. Now, of course, beyond the mere blunt trauma of getting hit by a very heavy object travelling extremely quickly, a warpstone bullet, if it lodges itself inside of the body, or even just passes straight through, will undoubtedly send slivers of warpstones coursing through the body's bloodstream. This will have remarkably volatile effects on normal creatures. In fact, it won't so much kill a person as it will violently tear them apart from the inside out. How this precisely happens varies greatly from individual to individual and is more up to the fickle nature of the warpstone than anything else. For example, let's say you're firing at an Empire Knight. The slab of warpstone easily punches through his pathetic armor and lodges itself somewhere around his balls. The warpstone would then go to work radically changing the knight's anatomy, for example by growing giant horns out of his anus and sinking his head into his chest. As you can probably imagine, this rather rapid transformation is very detrimental to one's continued well-being, and usually leads to the very, very messy death of the person hit. In the case of other Skaven and Chaos worshippers or trolls, other things that are already heavily affected by Chaos and its mutagenic properties, the bullet will have less of a devastating effect, although it doesn't really matter how used you are to mutations. If you suddenly sprout an arm out through your chest, it's probably going to be a pretty damn severe inconvenience to you in the short run. But nevertheless, it will have a somewhat limited effect. However, you have still been shot by a very heavy projectile travelling at ridiculous speeds, which again tends to be rather detrimental to one's well-being. There is, however, one itsy-bitsy, teensy-weensy drawback with using warpstone as ammunition and as gunpowder, or, well, using warpstone in general. Warpstone is somewhat volatile. Just handling warpstone is likely to kill a normal human in a rather horrifying manner, and in fact even being in the same room as warpstone is quite likely to have some rather adverse effects. The Skaven have grown quite accustomed to warpstone, however, and are very resistant to its warping effects, to the point where they can handle it and even eat it without any, well, deadly side effects, at the very least. Although, saying that, warpstone is still a fairly considerable cause of death amongst Skaven, so, you know, Harmless, it certainly ain't, but it's far less likely to kill a Skaven than it is to kill a human, and again, you can build up a gradual resistance against Warpstone. Many Grey Seers, for example, use Warpstone to fuel their spells, and in much the same way, a Warplock engineer can get his body accustomed to Warpstone by exposing himself to minute trace amounts of it slowly over a long period of time, and then slowly but surely upping the dosage, until he can essentially handle Warpstone directly with his bare paws without any immediately detrimental effects, although gloves are still rather recommended. Granted, there's still the infinitesimally small chance that your gloves might turn into carnivorous plants and eat your hands, but again, it's all part of the great game. Speaking of the engineers, however, we've kind of gone over how Warpstone affects it and the general attitude inside of Clan Skryre, but it does have a hierarchy like all good systems do, and especially Skaven systems. It's very important to know who you can kick down at. This is a very normal thing within Skaven society, and the political and social dance of hierarchy and rank is extremely important. As with most Skaven organizations, the absolute bottom of the barrel is of course the slaves, used as manual labor, miners predominantly, to go get the Warpstone and the various resources used in the production of Clan Skryre's various lovely inventions, as test subjects, as target practice, as, well, food, quite frequently, and naturally as laboratory aids, to carry out some of the more, experimental aspects of a warlock's work. You know, mixing Warpstone and gunpowder, that's a fairly well-known process. Like, it's relatively safe. There's about a 50-50 chance of it blowing up half of the room. You know, safe by Skaven standards. However, perhaps a warlock engineer decides that he needs a better way of feeding his slaves, because this is a constant problem in Skaven Blight. They are trucking in barge upon barge upon barge of black grain, but there's a lot of Skaven, and feeding the little fuckers can be a damn real issue. So how about we try to apply the standard Skaven solution? Hit it with Warpstone. What effect would, say, spraying the fields with Warpstone have? Now, of course, this would be trace amounts of Warpstone, because it is far too valuable to simply throw away just to feed the teeming masses of Skaven Blight, but what would happen? Well, some brave warlocks would indeed try to test this out on a small scale personally, but, you know, small scale doesn't really work, and large scale exposure to Warpstone, well, that has long since passed the level of mere bravery and entered the realms of fucking stupid. As such, we use the slaves. Let's say that we take the Warpstone, we crush it into a fine powder, and add it to water. Then we give the slave a tank filled with the contaminated water and some instrument used to spray it over the crops. Then you send the slaves off into the crops, and you see what happens. Now, best case scenario, maybe the plants will mutate and produce more plants. Perhaps it'll be some kind of fleshy growth on them, perhaps. Perhaps they would simply be more nutritious, or maybe we'd come up with a new combat stimulus, for example, that would drive warriors to the heights of ferocity, and make them overcome their more natural Skaven instincts to turn tail and flee once presented with walls of pointy objects. Or alternatively, maybe the plants just turn into flesh-eating monstrosities, eat the slave, and then rampage through the undercity of Skaven Blight. All of these are possible and more or less acceptable consequences. And, I mean, who knows? Maybe it will be possible to hunt down and euthanize the monstrous creatures rampaging through the city and eat them. Entirely possible, and at the very least, you can definitely eat the various mangled corpses that are left behind, so yeah, that would still be considered a fairly solid success. Maybe not something to conduct on a large scale all that frequently, but certainly a possibility. Then above the slaves, we have the clan rats, which fulfill a variety of tasks within Clan Skryre. They are the soldiers, so the merchants, the traders, and again occasionally food source, but far more rarely than the Skaven slaves, and essentially make up the general population. A handful of these might be selected for the very honourable position of lab assistants, which in most cases means, again, kind of test subject / target practice, but occasionally a few of these lab assistants will prove themselves skilled enough and valuable enough and, well, to be honest, lucky enough to not die within the first few weeks, and may then be elevated to the rank of engineer. Now, again, the rank of engineer has many different ranks within it again, much like clan rats, but it is certainly a hell of a lot higher than the average run-of-the-mill Skaven, as, at the very least, if you are an engineer, you are afforded a certain amount of respect within Clan Skryre. And if by some miracle the Skaven in question manages to not only survive, but flourish as an engineer, which is no easy task, let me tell you, then he might one day be promoted, or, well, more accurately, he will eat his former master and take his place, and become a warlock engineer. This new position comes with a wide range of benefits and perks, chief amongst them being that you can now order other engineers to carry out the more glorious parts of experiments, and still take the full credit for your very own, because after all, you have deserved it. And in all due reality, the glory and credit needs to be protected from those treacherous, backstabbing, and frankly incompetent underlings. I mean, can you imagine what would happen to the great Skaven Empire, and more importantly, your position in it, if such incompetent and self-serving ass monkeys got into a position of real power? Laughable. But of course, this is nowhere near the top of the social hierarchy. It's a pretty damn good position, and this is where most Skaven will end up until someone below them kills and eats them, or kills them by eating them, one out of the two, but there is still a few possibilities to increase one's prestige, mostly by creating bigger and better things. In general, once a Skaven engineer has created something he believes to be worthy of further exploration and funding, he can bring it before his overlords, who will then decide if it's useful or not. If it's not, well, maybe the Skaven is allowed to go back to his workshop, or maybe he will face an early retirement by Nom Nom. However, in the unlikely event that his dingety bob is actually deemed useful enough, the item will then be showed to the Lords of Decay, the ruling body of Skavendom, and if they again find this item worthy of further study and development, a grant might be set up for the Skaven in question. Now, this is essentially a dream come true for any warlock engineer, as this is not just simply a promise of money. This is an endorsement by at least some of the Council of 13, which carries some serious political leverage in the Skaven Under-Empire. This will essentially allow the warlock engineer in question to boss other warlock engineers around, and bossing other Skaven around is pretty much what Skavens live and breathe for. And this, in all due reality, is about as far up along the Clan Skryre rank ladder as you can possibly climb. The only thing really above you in this case would be your clan leader, which is usually the engineer with the most backing, both politically and financially, from the other clan lords and possibly even the Lords of Decay, or the Lord Warlock himself and his right-hand claw, Ikit Claw. And any Skaven who has managed to get this far up the ladder has a well-developed sense of self-preservation, who at this point should be yelling at the Skaven in question to stay fucking put, because taking on a Lord of Decay, as the Lord Warlock is, and Ikit Claw, well, that's just a downright bad fucking idea. A few particularly suicidal individuals have allegedly tried to do this and have met remarkably grisly ends, although in all due honesty, very few Skaven, in fact I go so far as to probably say no Skaven would be stupid enough to do so, so in all due likelihood, these are just some of the engineers that managed to piss off either Ikit or Moskitar himself, and they just decided to make an example out of him. You know, along the lines of, oh no, he didn't know his place, that's why that horrible accident with the warp grinder happened. But don't worry, that will never happen to you guys because you all know your place. Despite this rather considerable blockage at the top, however, Clan Skryre is a meritocracy, or at the very least as close to Skavendom will ever get to a meritocracy. A survivortocracy is perhaps a better word for it, and anyone can potentially, unless you're a slave, rise to the top. Or at least as close to the top as you can get, without Morskitar or Ikid Claw determining that you're a rival and therefore needs dealing with. And with that, I will leave you. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.